Okay, I've got this crazy situation, and so I thought I would talk about it here and maybe get some advice. I recently reached out to an LDS scholar and apologist who had found some stuff that I thought was incredible and that fitted in with my concept and understanding that Joseph had written the Book of Mormon. He found some literary dependency, which he believed was a real faithful reminder that the people in the Book of Mormon were ancient. And I saw the same evidence as something that indicated that Joseph was involved in the dictation. I'll share his findings in another video, but to show him what I was interested and concerned about, I sent him the indication of Mosiah 9 and 10 that we've talked about before, and the dependency of those two chapters on each other. This is where you can line up Mosiah 9 next to Mosiah 10 and see that they follow the same literary pattern. And this happens throughout the whole text of those two chapters, in fact, in very specific ways. There are over 31 direct comparisons between the two texts. And then there is also this understanding or this feeling that these two chapters are quite different because of a section in each chapter that describe Lamanites, but they do it in two different ways. And yet those two different ways have their own interesting comparisons. This shows to me that these two chapters are composed, that they're crafted, and that what is likely happening is that Joseph is memorizing points and then he's recalling them in an oratory way to provide a completely different story. And because he's so good at this, these two stories feel connected and yet very distinct. It shows a high level of complexity and the idea that this oral environment produces this great, rich literary extension. The crazy thing is that this LDS scholar loves what I have done. He has done a paper on Zenith and he didn't see this literary convention, and he believes that this is a significant extension to the work that he has done, and he wants to do a paper and have me co-author the paper on Zenith and this example in Mosiah 9 and 10 to add to his conversation about those particular kings. I've read his original paper and it's quite brilliant and amazing, except for the fact that I think it's completely the wrong end of the stick. And so I'm in this strange situation where he wants me to co-author with him in extending his paper, which I don't really believe in, except for the fact that I really enjoy the way that he interprets things. So I'm not entirely sure what to do, and it would be useful to have some of your opinions, particularly over this passage of Mosiah 9 and 10 and its literary convention, and what you might do to explain why it is there and what it is doing, and some of the strengths and weaknesses of it being either historical and ancient or being a product of Joseph Smith. And I've collected a lot of these parallel stories, and so maybe over the next few videos I'll go through each one of them and you can give me your opinion on whether you think I'm reading it right and whether these are proofs for ancient antiquity or proofs for Joseph Smith's involvement. This is the literary dependency that this LDS scholar and apologist found. It's quite brilliant. He talks about how Moroni is the last record keeper in the Book of Mormon, but the last record keeper in the small plates is actually Amaleki. And so you can use Moroni 10, which is the last chapter of the Book of Mormon, and compare it with Amaleki's works in Omni and find some really interesting literary dependency, which this scholar suggests that Moroni is really looking at Amaleki and identifying with him and using his pattern to be able to craft a new extension. I see this as Joseph forming an ending in Omni and then deciding that this is a good ending and he'll extend upon it for Moroni. Here's the comparison side by side of Omni 1 and Moroni 10. In yellow, I've highlighted those things which are directly related, and in green, I've highlighted those things which are similar but not the same wording. And you can also see in blue where I've highlighted a list, and this list is also in the same order and the same wording. But you can easily see from the comparison from left to right in Omni to Moroni 10 that Moroni 10 is a lot longer. It's got more information and it's definitely more dense, which suggests that Moroni 10 is dependent on Omni 1, not the other way around. So Omni 1 is quite tight, and Moroni 10 is an expansion of that because the theory is good, but also there's much more that Moroni can say. Or in my example, this is Joseph. He's formulated an ending, and then he's gone, oh, this is good. I can expand this and make it even better. And you can see that there's these same points in the same order and very much delivering the same kind of effect. And these are brilliant examples of how there are these repeated ideas and storylines being crafted in unique ways as they're being done again. In the Mosiah 9 and 10 example I gave, which are side by side, you see that there's huge transfer across. In this example between Amaleki and Moroni, which is probably some distance apart, you see that there's definitely a conscious choice to expand it. Let me know what you think about these particular comparisons, what you see, maybe some ideas of which you might be able to see this as ancient or historical, or in other ways that you might be able to see this as Joseph's extension of a storyline he's already produced, which he then expands on. One of my favorite repeated stories is that of King Noah in the Book of Mosiah and King Replikish in the Book of Ether. Noah is the quintessential bad guy in the Book of Mormon, and people know him because he put to death Abinadi, who tried to tell him that he was wrong. But also bad guys are much more interesting characters than good guys, and so Noah occupies a large space in Mormon folklore and understanding. Noah is also incredibly important because he is the origin story of Alma, who becomes a big part of the understanding of the gospel in the Book of Mormon. The two accounts which exist in Mosiah chapter 11 and Ether chapter 10 are slightly different lengths, but they have the same progression, the same events, and also the same wording. So what we see is that there's a righteous father, there's a son that does not keep the commandments, there's wives and concubines, there are heavy taxes, they build spacious buildings, include a fine throne, have fine workmanship, afflict their people, and people rebel against them, and they are then killed and their supporters driven out. This 11-point story arc exists in both the understanding of King Noah and also the understanding of King Replikish. But you can see from the side-by-side comparisons, there are a number of statements that are almost exactly the same that feature on both accounts. And you can see that it continues throughout the whole of the storylines in the same kinds of ways. There is one section that is not in order, but all the rest of them are in the same order and in the same kind of explanation. The Ether version is slightly longer, suggesting that it was written later, and indeed in the Mosiah priority, Ether is written after Mosiah. But in terms of the timeline, Ether should have been hundreds, if not thousands of years earlier than Mosiah. The side-by-side comparison shows a high direct correlation between the two texts. And these are from two different parts of the Book of Mormon. Mosiah's the Mormon abridgment, and Ether is the Moroni abridgment. And we've already seen from the two different previous examples that the chapters Mosiah 9 and 10 are both from the Mormon abridgment, and the Amaleki and Moroni version suggests that there is a small plates and then the Moroni abridgment, those two different areas. What I think is fascinating about the ether version, and we'll talk about this quite a bit more later, is that it seems to incorporate a lot of the understandings and storylines from the Book of Mormon proper, which I think means that the Book of Ether was produced in a bit of a hurry to fill a plot hole, and it just essentially just regurgitated the whole Book of Mormon story as a Reader's Digest version for the people who are reading. The other thing to note is that both of these stories, in Mosiah about King Noah and Ether about King Replicash, talk about these wives and concubines' understanding of kings and how they go astray. How sexual excess is something that kings end up doing. In the Mosiah priority timeline, this means that King Noah was first, Replicash was second, and then what we see in Jacob chapter 2 about the idea of Nephites taking wives and concubines, that is third. But if you look at Jacob chapter 1, you see that what has preceded Nephites taking further wives and concubines is the idea that kings in the Nephite line have become corrupt and are now taking excess sexual partners. And this seems to be a real common theme that the Book of Mormon talks against, which, as you well know, becomes a big contradiction later on in the Nauvoo period when Joseph himself starts taking wives and concubines. Another quintessential bad guy in the Book of Mormon is described in Alma chapter 30, and that is Korihor. Now, I've been called a Korihor in state conference nonetheless, so I'm really interested in this particular character. He is an antichrist who leads the people astray. And what's really interesting about his story, and why I think it's so important, is that he has a companion, a sister repeated story that suggests to me that Korihor is a character, not an actual person or event. The other version of the Korihor story is in the replacement text with Sherem in Jacob chapter 7. Now the accounts, although they are slightly different lengths, and you can see I placed Sherem on the left and Korihor on the right, but actually in the Mosiah priority dictation sequence, it's actually the reverse. And you can see a little bit from just even the visuals of the text that Jacob chapter 7 is slightly longer and maybe a little bit more sophisticated, which suggests the Sherem story is dependent on the Korihor story. And these both have the same beginning, the progression, the type of characters, the language, and the outcome. We first have an antichrist who preaches, who leads the people, leads the hearts away. We have this conversation with a high priest. There's this denial of prophecy. He gets refuted. There's an appeal to the Holy Spirit. He asks for a sign. He's warned not to tempt God. He's struck down, confesses his deception, dies badly, and then the people are converted. And you can see with these two stories, there are the same ideas, the same phrases in the same order. And when you go through it, you see that the ideas line up perfectly and the outcome is exactly the same. And while King Noah is a cautionary tale about wickedness and excess, Korihor is a cautionary tale about apostasy. And what's great about this particular repeated story is that Korihor is in Alma, which is in the Mormon abridgment, and Sherem is in Jacob, which is in the Nephite portion and account, which suggests that the replacement text is done by the same person who did the Mormon abridgment. I wonder who that person could be. And the other great thing for me about this is that it suggests that Korihor is a character and Sherem is a character. These are not real people, and this is not a real event. This is just a lesson, an allegory, and maybe a bad one. When it comes to missionary work, a great hero story in the Book of Mormon is that of the four sons of Mosiah's mission to the Lamanites. It is exemplified by this man, Ammon, who defends the flocks of the Lamanite king and gets a great audience with him, in which he's able to then teach him the gospel and convert him to Jesus. This is recounted in Alma chapter 17, and there's a parallel story just a few chapters later in Alma chapter 22 with Aaron, one of the brothers, as well. The stories are both long and they have incredible parallels, and probably one of the biggest parallels across the whole of the Book of Mormon. They went to preach, they seek to be a servant of the Lamanite king. The Spirit directs them and tells them that they should preach and help the king to believe, and they recite a statement with regard to belief. There's a great spirit that is explained with that whole kind of Indian understanding of the great spirit being God and identified as God, or as missionaries term it, building on common beliefs. That God has created all things. The king believes. They rehearse the creation, the plan of redemption. There's some expounding being done. The king prays. And then the king faints, the wife is notified, the king rises, the household is converted, the multitude gather, sometimes the multitude murmur, the king speaks, and Aaron and Ammon are both administer to the people, and then the king grants access for the gospel to be taught amongst his kingdom. These are both incredibly long passages, so I've kind of truncated them a little bit in relation to the text, just so that I could show the comparisons without having large bits of text that aren't comparative. But you can see from the side by side that there are the same words in the same order with the same understandings and the same outcome. And just like with Mosiah 9 and 10 in the Zenith story, there is enough differences between these two passages that make them feel like they are completely separate stories. But when you line them up side by side, you can see that they're following the same narrative arc with hitting the same points in the same order, which, like Mosiah 9 and 10, show that this oral recitation of these memorized points can produce a completely different text, so that there's enough feeling between them that you don't recognize that it's the same story repeated. And for me, as a young man reading this for the first time when I was 14, 15 years old, these stories about these hero missionaries were really impactful to me. One of my memorized scriptures from Scripture Mastery comes from one of these accounts. O God, Aaron hath told me that there is a God, and if there art a God, and if thou art God, wilt thou make thyself known unto me, and I will give away all my sins to know thee. And as the king said these words, he was struck as if he were dead. That was almost 40 years ago, and I can still remember it as if it was yesterday. But now when I look at the text and I see it side by side, I see the composition aspect and understanding embedded behind what is being told. And it still fills me with a bit of awe. I've just talked about a number of really long repeated stories in the Book of Mormon with characters that have trajectories in terms of their storylines. But there are lots of little story repeats that are really interesting. Moroni is an incredibly important character in the Book of Mormon because he's the one who finishes the record and buries it, and then appears to Joseph some 1400 years later. He occupies a lot of space in Mormon folklore. He's kind of the linchpin for the credibility of the Book of Mormon because he transfers the ancient record through to the modern inception. One of the really interesting things about Moroni is that he ends the record of the Book of Mormon several times, and you can track that. And we already did a video around Moroni's last ending in Mormon, or Moroni chapter 10, being a type of the last ending from the small plates of Ameleki and Omni, and seeing the parallel story there. But there are more. Have a look at this one. This is Mormon chapter 8, verses 1 to 5, and this is just after Moroni gets the plates from his father Mormon and then basically ends the record. This is the first Moroni ending. Actually, he goes on to write more, and that becomes the rest of Mormon chapter 8 and also Mormon chapter 9, and that is another Moroni ending. And then he has to do Ether, and so there's another ending in Ether chapter 4 and 5, and then there's another ending in Ether chapter 12, and I'll explain how come we're having all of these different endings. But there is another ending, and that is the end of the book of Ether, which is Ether chapter 15. And the very ending of Ether chapter 15 matches the wording and expressions and trajectory of the ending that is happening in Mormon chapter 8, verses 1 to 5. I've laid them out side by side here in this comparison, and you see it here too. The yellow is the same wording, the green is the same idea or theme, and the purple in this case is the same wording, but not in the same order. So what's really interesting about this particular example is that even though there is the same wording, it's not in exactly the same order. It's twisted around a little bit. It makes it feel a little bit more unique. But when you start to look at the various components of Moroni's ending in Mormon chapter 8, verses 1 to 5, you can see that it has the same composition pieces, but they're just slightly arranged differently in Ether chapter 15. This seems to suggest that Joseph, as he's using this narrative template, is able to be a bit more flexible, and in this instance is. And this means that if you're not actually paying attention to the text, you can't quite tell that they're the same components, which is a little fascinating and slightly genius, but also we can track it. Some of the repeated stories are really interesting in the way that they are crafted, because they can often take the same kind of idea and yet present it in completely different ways, and even combine two stories into a single narrative later. So we're going to look at this one, which is Omni, which is the end of the replacement text, and Mosiah in both Mosiah chapter 25 and Mosiah chapter 28. Now, in the Mosiah priority, the Mosiah chapters are written before the Omni chapter, which is written really at the very end. But I've got the side by side with Omni on the left and Mosiah on the right, just because of the timeline chronology. Mosiah chapter 25 and Mosiah chapter 28 relate some migration groups from the land of Nephi-Lehi into Zarahemla. And the passage in Omni also relates a migration from the land of Nephi-Lehi into Zarahemla. But they are two different Mosiahs. There's Mosiah 1, then his son King Benjamin, and then Mosiah 2. And the other thing to know is that Omni is supposed to harmonize the replacement text with the main feature, the Mormon abridgment. And so it's really telling the story about how Mosiah the First got to Zarahemla, and that he met the Mulekites at that particular point, this other group of people that had come out of Jerusalem, and then together they had formed a nation. And so these two texts, which are based on two different King Mosiahs, are now being placed into the text in a very similar way. And as you can see from the text, you can see them, just dovetailing as the similarities go forward, back and forth. So they follow the same trajectory. We've got King Mosiah, There's the people of Zarahemla and their descendants of Mulakai, and they've come from the wilderness, and the people of Zarahemla are numerous, and the people of Mosiah and the people of Zarahemla unite together, and the records are brought to King Mosiah, and he translates them, and this is what we see as the culmination of the Americas. And you can see when we put Omni next to Mosiah chapter 25 that we can go down the verses and pick out the points. It's not a long passage, but at least it gives you a really great chronology and comparison. And then we can continue with that passage in Omni and now substitute in Mosiah chapter 28, and we get the same things happening there. Now, there was probably originally a story in the lost manuscript that talked about how Mosiah the king got to Zarahemla, but that is kind of lost to this lost manuscript. However, we have this kind of, abridgment, this Reader's Digest version, but then subtly makes the same kinds of points. And so it's another example of these storylines being utilized again with the same points in the same order. But in this case, it's been condensed for the small plates. Now, this next repeated story is a really interesting one because it's a repeated story of the same events recalled later in exactly the same kind of way. Now, in many ways, they should be very similar, and they are, except for the fact that they're so similar in the same kinds of ways and then different in other ways. And so you can just see that as a repeated story, just like the others, and which might be actually identified by people reading the Book of Mormon and just dismissed as the fact that it's just recounting the same events. And this is an example where two stories, in this case in Mosiah 7 and Mosiah 8, are combined into what is now Mosiah 21. And the first part of the story relates to when Ammon first goes to the land of Nephi-Lehi and encounters Limhi and gets arrested, basically taken to jail, and then Limhi is curious about these invaders and then investigates and interrogates them. And as he finds out that these are actually people from Zarahemla, he is happy, he's excited, and he is hopeful that he can be rescued. So that's the chapter 7 in Mosiah part, which is at the beginning part of Mosiah chapter 21. Then we have the Mosiah 8 part, which is when Limhi talks to Ammon and tells him about how he sent out people to find Zarahemla. They got lost. They brought home another record that was from this group of people who were destroyed in the North Country. And this, we learn, is the people of the Jaredites. This is also recalled in Mosiah chapter 21, with the same phrases and ideas, and then this is recalled in Mosiah chapter 21 with the same phrases in the same order, with the same understanding, and yet quite a few things that are different. And you can kind of see that the account in Mosiah chapter 7 and chapter 8 is actually longer than the recall that is happening in Mosiah chapter 21. And it gives you a good idea that there's this mixing and matching that's going on where two unrelated stories are then being combined later as a combined story. And so it's fascinating, and it kind of gives some insight into what Joseph is doing and how he is crafting his stories. This next repeated story is fascinating for several reasons. It is found in Mosiah chapter 22, and it is about the escape of Limhi and his people. All the repeated stories we've talked about so far, except for Mosiah 9 and 10, are separated. They are sometimes a few chapters later, as in the case of Ammon and Aaron. They can be, different books like Korihor and Alma chapter 30 and Sherem and Jacob chapter 7. But this particular one is within the same chapter. It's really small, it's really dense, and it only occupies a few verses. So here's the side by side, and it covers Mosiah chapter 22, verses 2 to 11. So it's pretty much most of this chapter. And I've labeled each of the parallels A, B, C, D, and E. You'll see that actually D is missing on the second half, just because it goes over the next page, but it's definitely there. But I just want you to look at this and see that there's an A, B, C, D, and E all in the same order, but then there's an A, B, C, E, and then D. So there's a part of this that is out of order, but you can see that the vast majority of it is in order, and it lines up from one side to the other. Now remember, this is all in the same chapter. It's all part of the same story. Now that's incredibly interesting, because if you can recite a story in a particular order and recite it again in that same order within the same passage of text, you could also do the same thing in reverse and create a chiasm. So, repeat the story one way and then repeat it backwards the second way. And we actually see this happen in the Book of Mormon. This is Helaman chapter 6. This is what people deem to be a chiasm. And you can see I've labeled it there. This goes from verse 7 to 13. So it's really tight. But I've labeled them A, B, C, D, and E in one way. And then you've got E, D, C, B, and A on the other side going down. And this is within one story passage in the Book of Mormon. Now, there's no reason why a narrative about events should be in a chiasm, because that means that it's crafted and put in place in that kind of a way. Events, narratives should be sequential, they should be history, but this certainly shows that this narrative has been crafted. Potentially, you could do a sermon in terms of a chiasm, because you lead up to a singular point and then draw back from that singular point, and that would be a way to craft your sermon. But when you're talking about a narrative, there really shouldn't be any chiasms. And I think what this shows from this passage in Mosiah chapter 22 and also Helaman 6 is that Joseph can craft this narrative, can craft an event sequence, repeat that event sequence one way or repeat it backwards to get these kinds of chiasm structures. But have a look at this. This is Helaman chapter 6, those same verses, 6 through to 13 this time. And this time instead of drawing a chiasm, I've drawn parallels. So there are two statements which seem to reflect the last statement, and I've color coded them pink and blue, so you can see them against each other as you go down the text. And you can see that you can also take the same passage in Helaman chapter 6 and find these kind of pairs of ideas that seem to mirror each other and are parallels. So this is another way to describe that same sequence in Helaman chapter 6. I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. What is the correct way of looking at this? Is it a chiasm type structure where the parallel has been repeated but backwards the second time? Or is it these parallel structures within the text that suggest that it's been crafted in a completely different way? What this suggests so strongly is that there is crafting going on behind the events that are happening in the Book of Mormon, that they've been thought out, they've been memorized, they've been performed, and this is why we get these repeated stories, but we also can, in some instances, get a chiasm. The really big question that you might be asking is, how can we tell that these repeated stories are due to Joseph and not to authors in the Book of Mormon? Well, firstly, the repeated stories are throughout the entirety of the Book of Mormon, and they transverse the different parts of the Book of Mormon, the Mormon abridgment, the Moroni abridgment, and Nephi's account in the replacement text. So whoever is crafting these stories is external to the Book of Mormon, not internal. But still, it would be good to have some proof. And we have some, because there are some things that Joseph wrote independent of the Book of Mormon that we then find in the Book of Mormon. While the Book of Mormon is being produced, Joseph is getting revelations alongside his work. And one particular revelation, which is Doctrine and Covenants section 3, has some really strong parallels to Alma chapter 37. Now, first off, you should know that Doctrine and Covenants section 3 is the revelation that Joseph gets after he loses the lost manuscript. And there's a lot of rebuking in that revelation for him personally about the fact that he's a record keeper. He should have kept the record safe. He shouldn't have let it into wicked hands, and that it was his responsibility, and he has failed. Alma chapter 37 is about Alma, the younger, passing the records onto his son, Helaman, and giving him a charge that he needs to keep these things safe, that there are some important aspects about being a record keeper which he needs to be in charge of, and that's really important that he does his job right. Now, both of these passages are long. Doctrine and Covenants section 3 and Alma chapter 37 occupy a number of pages. And you can see, as I'm going to go through it right now, that they line up side by side. Again, the yellow describes direct phrases that are the same, and the green are similar ideas repeated. The lineup begins in Doctrine and Covenants section 3 verse 1 and Alma 37 verse 12. While there's a similar understanding to the backbone of these two arrangements, they are quite different. And so there's these large passages, particularly in Doctrine and Covenants section 3, which are not preserved in Alma chapter 37. But as you keep going down the passage, you see that things line up really well and incredibly close. So this is an incredibly long passage, which just gives so many great comparisons that it's just, you can see that Alma chapter 37 is dependent on the revelation in Doctrine and Covenants section 3. One of the other similarities between the two chapters is the understanding of this being directed, or the directors, which is probably the seer stone. And these are mirrored both in Doctrine and Covenants section 3 and in Alma 37. However, later iterations of the Book of Mormon change the word directors that are in Alma 37 to interpreters, which is a more common understanding in Mosiah. So those two passages are incredibly brilliant because they show that Joseph is the Genesis. He's the person who's getting these two story arcs, and they're repeating them in these very predictable ways, or at least ways that we can see that they're dependent on one another. These repeated stories act as a fingerprint, and the fingerprints track right back to Joseph Smith.